Two American pilots sat trapped in a German prison, 80 miles behind enemy lines. Their only escape was a single-seat fighter plane. One cockpit. 1 seat. Two desperate men who needed to fly home before the enemy caught them. What happened next seemed absolutely impossible. Before you watch full story, comment below from which country are you watching. Don't forget to subscribe for more amazing stories. On March 14, 1945, two American pilots sat in a dark German prison cell 80 miles behind enemy lines. Captain Richard Peterson and Lieutenant David Walsh had been prisoners of war for 11 days. They had been shot down, captured, interrogated, and locked in a concrete building that smelled like mold and old sweat. Outside their cell window, they could hear German guards talking. Dogs barking, truck engines starting and stopping. The war was ending. The Allies were advancing from the west. The Russians were pushing from the east. Germany was collapsing. But Peterson and Walsh were still prisoners. Still 80 miles from freedom. Then the air raid sirens started screaming. Allied bombers were coming. The guards ran for the shelters. And in the chaos that followed, two American pilots saw their chance to escape. But escaping was only the first problem. Getting home was going to be much harder. Because the only aircraft they could find was a single-seat P-51 Mustang. One engine. 1 cockpit. 1 seat. And two men who needed to fly 200 miles to Allied territory before the Germans caught them again. If you want to see how these captured pilots pulled off the impossible, hit that like button right now. Every like helps us share these forgotten stories. Subscribe if you have not already. Now let me tell you how this started. 11 days earlier, Captain Richard Peterson had been leading a bomber escort mission over western Germany. He commanded a flight of 4 P-51 Mustangs from the 352nd Fighter Group. Their job was simple. Protect the B-17 bombers on their way to hit German factories near Frankfurt. Peterson was 27 years old. He had flown 63 combat missions. He had shot down 4 German fighters. He was 2 weeks away from completing his tour and going home to his wife in Oklahoma. He just needed to survive 2 more weeks. Lieutenant David Walsh flew as his wingman. He was 24 years old with 31 combat missions. He had arrived in England 4 months earlier. Peterson had taken him under his wing, teaching him how to stay alive in the air. How to watch for German fighters, how to manage fuel on long missions, how to bring your aircraft home when things went wrong. The mission started normally. The 4 Mustangs met the bomber formation at 22,000 feet over Belgium. The bombers droned toward Germany in tight formation. The fighters weaved above them, scanning the sky for threats. The morning was cold and clear. Visibility was perfect. The German fighters appeared at 10:17 hours. 8 Focke-Wulf 190s diving out of the sun. They came fast, targeting the bomber formation. Peterson called out the warning and led his flight to intercept. The sky erupted into a swirling dogfight. Peterson shot down 1 German fighter in the first pass. His 650 caliber machine guns tore into the Focke-Wulf's engine. The German aircraft rolled over and went down trailing black smoke. Peterson pulled up hard to avoid the debris. That was when the second German fighter got him. Peterson never saw it coming. A burst of 20 mm cannon fire hit his P-51 from behind. Shells punched through the fuselage. The cockpit filled with smoke. Warning lights blazed across his instrument panel. His engine began losing power. Walsh saw his leader take the hit. He broke off his own attack and moved to cover Peterson. But another Focke-Wulf was already on him. Walsh tried to turn inside the German fighter. He pulled too hard. His aircraft stalled and fell into a spin. Walsh fought the controls. The ground was spinning below him. Trees, fields, a river, everything rotating faster and faster. He finally recovered from the spin at 3,000 feet. But his engine was damaged. Coolant streamed from his radiator. He had maybe 5 minutes of power remaining. Peterson's voice crackled on the radio. His aircraft was dying. He was going down. Walsh looked for his captain and spotted him 2 miles away, losing altitude fast. Both men were in the same desperate situation. Both engines failing, both aircraft going down behind enemy lines. Peterson found a field and crash-landed first. His Mustang belly landed in frozen mud, skidding to a stop near a line of bare trees. He climbed out of the wreckage, pulled his pistol, and started running toward the woods. Walsh came down half a mile away. His landing was rougher. The Mustang hit hard, the landing gear collapsed, and the aircraft slid across the field on its belly. Walsh hit his head on the gunsight. Blood ran down his face. But he was alive. He scrambled out of the cockpit and ran. The German soldiers arrived within 10 minutes. A truck full of Wehrmacht troops had been stationed nearby. They surrounded both crash sites with rifles ready. Dogs tracked the pilots through the woods. Peterson made it less than a mile before the dogs found him. Walsh was caught trying to hide in a barn. The Germans searched them, took their pistols and survival gear, and loaded them into the back of a military truck. They were driven to a regional Luftwaffe base 40 miles away. There, they were locked in separate cells for interrogation. The interrogation lasted 3 days. German intelligence officers asked questions about their squadron, their base, their aircraft specifications, their mission plans. Both pilots gave only their name, rank, and serial number. Nothing else. The Germans grew frustrated but did not harm them. By March 1945, the Luftwaffe still followed the Geneva Convention rules for prisoners of war. After interrogation, the 2 pilots were moved to a temporary holding facility. This was not a proper prison camp like Stalagsluft. It was just a converted warehouse with barred windows and concrete cells. The building held about 40 Allied prisoners waiting to be transferred to permanent camps. Peterson and Walsh were put in the same cell. A room measuring 10 feet by 12 feet. 2 wooden bunks. 1 bucket for a toilet. 1 small window with iron bars. The door was solid oak with a small slot for passing food. They received 2 meals a day. Watery soup and black bread in the morning, more soup and a potato in the evening. The food was barely enough to survive. Peterson lost 8 pounds in 11 days. Walsh lost 6. Both men grew weaker as the days passed. The cold was constant. March in Germany was still winter. The cell had no heat. At night, temperatures dropped below freezing. The 2 pilots huddled under thin blankets, trying to stay warm. Their breath formed clouds in the air. Their fingers went numb. Sleep was difficult when you were shivering constantly. But the worst part was not knowing what would happen next. Would they be sent to a permanent camp? Would they spend the rest of the war in prison? Would they survive long enough to see the war end? The guards gave them no information. They just brought food twice a day and locked the door. Peterson spent his time watching the guards. He counted how many there were. He noted their routines. He observed when they changed shifts. He studied the layout of the building through his cell window. He was looking for any weakness, any opportunity. Walsh thought his captain was wasting his time. They were locked in a concrete building surrounded by armed guards. Escape was impossible. But Peterson kept watching. He kept planning. He had promised his wife he would come home. He was not going to spend the rest of the war in a German prison if he could help it. On the 10th day, Peterson noticed something important. The building was located next to an airfield. Through their cell window, they could see German aircraft parked on the tarmac. Mostly Messerschmitt 109s and Focke-Wulf 190s. But there was also one aircraft that made Peterson's heart race. A P-51 Mustang painted in German colors. The Germans had captured it weeks earlier and were testing it. They wanted to understand American fighter technology. The aircraft sat on the far side of the airfield, about 400 yards from the prison building. Guards walked past it occasionally, but it was not heavily protected. Peterson told Walsh his plan. If they could escape the building, they could reach that Mustang. If they could start the engine, they could take off before the Germans stopped them. If they could get airborne, they could fly to Allied territory. Walsh thought it was insane. Too many ifs, too many things that could go wrong. But then he looked at his captain's face. Peterson was serious. He was going to try this whether Walsh helped or not. And Walsh was not going to let his captain go alone. They just needed an opportunity. They needed the guards to be distracted. They needed chaos. They needed luck. And on March 14, 1945, they got it. The air raid sirens began wailing at 1,420 hours. Peterson and Walsh were in their cell eating their afternoon soup when the siren started. The sound was loud and urgent. Allied bombers were approaching. They heard shouting in the hallway. Boots running, orders being yelled in German. Through their window, they saw guards sprinting toward the air raid shelters. Pilots ran to their aircraft, trying to get fighters in the air before the bombers arrived. The building shook as the first bombs hit the airfield. The explosions were close. Dust fell from the ceiling. The window rattled in its frame. More bombs. Closer. The Germans were taking a heavy beating. Peterson ran to the cell door and looked through the slot. The hallway was empty. All the guards had abandoned their posts to take cover in the shelters. This was the chance they had been waiting for. This was their moment. The cell door was locked with a simple bolt mechanism on the outside. Peterson had studied it every day for 11 days. He knew exactly how it worked. He pulled off his belt and fed it through the slot. He worked the leather strap around the bolt. He pulled. The bolt slid. The door opened. They were out of the cell. But they were still inside the building. They moved quickly down the hallway, checking every corner. The building was deserted. Every guard, every officer, every German soldier was in the shelters waiting for the bombing to stop. They found a side door and slipped outside. The airfield was chaos. Black smoke rose from burning buildings. Bomb craters pitted the runway. German aircraft were scattered across the tarmac, some damaged, some intact. Anti-aircraft guns were firing at the bombers overhead. No one was paying attention to two men in dirty flight suits running across the field. The captured P-51 Mustang sat exactly where Peterson had last seen it. 400 yards from the prison building. The aircraft looked intact. No visible damage. The Germans had painted it with their own markings, but it was still an American fighter underneath. They reached the aircraft and climbed onto the wing. Peterson pulled open the canopy. The cockpit smelled like German cigarettes and leather. But the controls were familiar. This was a P-51D, the same model Peterson had flown dozens of times. Then Walsh asked the question that had been bothering him. How were they both going to fit in a single-seat fighter? The cockpit was built for one pilot. Not two. There was no room for a passenger. No second seat. Nothing. Peterson looked at his wingman. He looked at the cockpit. He looked at the German guards starting to emerge from their shelters 300 yards away. He made his decision. They would both fit. They had to. Because the alternative was going back to that prison cell. The cockpit of a P-51D Mustang measured 38 inches wide and 42 inches from the seat to the canopy rail. It was designed for one pilot wearing a parachute, survival vest, and flight gear. Peterson and Walsh had no parachutes. No survival gear. Just their dirty prison clothes and their determination to get home. Peterson climbed in first. He was the pilot. He needed to reach the controls. He lowered himself into the seat and pushed down as far as possible. His back pressed against the armored seat plate. His legs extended beneath the instrument panel on either side of the control stick. Walsh climbed in after him. He sat on Peterson's lap with his legs straddling Peterson's thighs. The fit was impossibly tight. Walsh's back pressed against Peterson's chest. The control stick jutted up between Walsh's knees. Their heads nearly touched the canopy glass. Peterson tried to reach around Walsh to grab the control stick. He could barely move his arms. Walsh was blocking his view of most instruments. But he could see the throttle on the left side. He could see the mixture control. He could see the fuel gauge showing 3/4 full. The smell in the cramped cockpit was overwhelming. Days of prison sweat mixed with fear and adrenaline. Neither man had bathed in 11 days. Their clothes were filthy. But there was no time to think about comfort. The German guards were getting closer. Walsh pulled the canopy closed. It latched with less than an inch of clearance above his head. The two men could barely breathe in the cramped space. Their combined body heat immediately began fogging the glass. But they were in. They were both in the aircraft. Through the fogged canopy, they saw German guards pointing at them. The guards had spotted the movement in the captured American fighter. They were shouting and running toward the aircraft. Some had rifles. Some had pistols. They were 200 yards away and closing fast. Peterson reached around Walsh and found the battery switch. He flipped it on. The instrument panel came to life. Gauges flickered. He hit the fuel pump switch. He set the mixture to full rich. He moved the throttle forward 1/2 inch. Then he pressed the starter. The Merlin engine coughed. Turned over, coughed again. The propeller rotated slowly. "Come on," Peterson whispered. "Come on. Start." The engine caught. The Merlin roared to life. 1,200 horsepower shook the airframe. Black smoke poured from the exhaust. The propeller spun faster. The Germans were 100 yards away and running hard. Peterson released the brakes and pushed the throttle forward. The Mustang began rolling across the tarmac. The Germans were shouting. Some raised their rifles and fired. Bullets cracked past the aircraft. One round starred the canopy near Walsh's shoulder. The overloaded fighter accelerated slowly. Peterson could feel the extra weight. The aircraft was sluggish. The controls felt heavy. He had never flown a Mustang with this much weight in the cockpit. He had no idea if it would even take off. The runway stretched ahead of them. Or what was left of it. The Allied bombing had left several craters in the concrete. Peterson would have to avoid them or risk damaging the landing gear. He steered the heavy fighter around the worst holes. The airspeed indicator climbed slowly. 60 miles per hour. 70, 80. Behind them, German soldiers were running to their vehicles. A truck started moving, trying to chase them down the runway. More rifles fired. More bullets cracked past the canopy. 90 miles per hour. 100, the Mustang normally lifted off around 100. But Peterson could feel the extra weight holding them down. The wheels were still firmly on the concrete. He needed more speed. More runway. More time. 110 miles per hour. 115, the end of the runway was approaching. Trees lined the perimeter of the airfield. If they ran out of concrete before getting airborne, they would crash into those trees at over 100 miles per hour. Peterson pulled back on the control stick. The stick moved between Walsh's knees with very limited range. He had to use both hands to get enough pull. The nose started to lift. The main wheels were still on the ground. Come on, he thought. Come on. 120 miles per hour. The wheels left the ground. The Mustang climbed slowly, struggling under its load. The stall warning horn began screaming. They were on the edge of falling out of the sky. Peterson eased forward slightly on the stick. The horn stopped. The trees rushed toward them. Peterson held the aircraft in a gentle climb. The Mustang gained altitude 1 foot at a time. The treetops passed beneath them with maybe 10 feet to spare. Then they were over the trees and climbing into the sky. They were airborne. 2 escaped American prisoners in a stolen German-marked P-51 Mustang. Flying without parachutes, without maps, without radios that worked. But they were free. They were in the air. And they were going home. Below them, the German airfield shrank into the distance. Anti-aircraft guns tracked their path but did not fire. The gunners probably assumed it was one of their own pilots taking the captured American fighter up for a test flight. By the time they realized the truth, the Mustang was gone. Peterson leveled off at 10,000 feet and turned west. He knew the general direction to Allied lines. West. Keep flying west and eventually they would cross into territory controlled by American or British forces. The question was whether they had enough fuel to make it. The fuel gauge showed 3/4 full. That was good for maybe 300 miles of flight. But Peterson had no idea exactly how far they were from Allied lines. 100 miles. 200. More. He had been unconscious when the Germans transported him to the prison. He could only guess. Inside the cramped cockpit, conditions were terrible. Walsh sat on Peterson's lap with his full weight pressing down. Peterson could feel his legs going numb. The circulation was being cut off. His feet started tingling. Then the sensation faded to nothing. Walsh tried to shift his weight to give Peterson some relief. He could not move even an inch. The space was too tight. They were locked in position like pieces in a puzzle. Walsh's back pressed against Peterson's chest. Peterson struggled to breathe under the weight. The canopy was fogging badly. Their combined breath and body heat created condensation on the glass. Peterson could barely see outside. He wiped the glass with his sleeve but it fogged again within seconds. Flying blind was dangerous. They could fly into a mountain. They could miss their landmarks. They could get lost. Walsh used his elbow to wipe the canopy from the inside. It helped for a few seconds before the fog returned. They developed a routine. Walsh would wipe the glass. Peterson would quickly scan outside for landmarks. Then the glass would fog again and they would repeat. Below them, the German countryside passed slowly. Brown fields, dark forests, small villages, rivers cutting through the landscape. Peterson kept the aircraft pointed west, using the sun as his compass. As long as they flew toward the sun, they were flying toward Allied territory. 30 minutes into the flight, they saw German fighters. 3 Messerschmitt 109s at their 2 o'clock position, flying in the opposite direction. Peterson held his breath. If the German pilots looked closely, they would see 2 men crammed into the P-51's cockpit. They would know something was wrong. But the Messerschmitts flew past without changing course. The German markings on the Mustang had fooled them. They assumed it was a friendly aircraft. Peterson exhaled slowly. That had been close. Too close. 60 minutes into the flight, Peterson checked the fuel gauge. Half full. They had burned a quarter of their fuel in 1 hour. At this rate, they had maybe 2 more hours of flight time. He hoped it would be enough. He prayed it would be enough. The pain in Peterson's legs was becoming unbearable. His entire lower body was numb. He could not feel his feet at all. He could not wiggle his toes. He knew that when they landed, if they landed, he would not be able to walk. Medical personnel would have to carry him from the aircraft. Walsh was suffering too. His back ached from sitting in an unnatural position. His neck hurt from holding his head at an angle to fit under the canopy. His arms were cramped from being pressed against his sides. Every muscle in his body screamed for relief. But there was nowhere to move. No way to stretch. No escape from the pain. Walsh spotted it first. A line on the horizon ahead. At first, he thought it was clouds. Then he realized what he was seeing. The front lines, the area where Allied and German forces were fighting. Smoke from artillery. Fires from destroyed vehicles, the scar across Europe where two armies met. They were close. Maybe 50 miles from crossing into Allied territory. Peterson felt hope rising in his chest. They were going to make it. Against all odds, they were actually going to make it home. Then the engine began to sputter. A cough. A miss. The smooth roar became irregular. Peterson glanced at the fuel gauge. Still showing a quarter tank. But something was wrong. The engine coughed again. Lost power for a second, recovered, coughed again. Fuel contamination. The Germans must have put bad fuel in the tank. Or water had gotten into the system. Or the fuel lines were clogged. Whatever the problem, the engine was dying. And they were still 50 miles from safety. Peterson adjusted the mixture control, trying to compensate for the bad fuel. The engine smoothed out slightly but continued missing. He had to keep the Mustang in the air for another 30 minutes. Just 30 more minutes and they would be over Allied territory. The engine coughed harder. Lost power completely for 3 seconds. The propeller windmilled. Then the engine caught again and kept running. Peterson's hands were shaking on the controls. He was exhausted from 11 days of prison rations. His legs were completely numb from Walsh's weight. His vision was starting to blur. Walsh could see the front lines getting closer. Smoke. Artillery flashes. The chaos of war. They were so close. Maybe 40 miles, maybe 30. He wanted to tell Peterson to push harder, to go faster. But he knew the engine was already giving everything it had. The Mustang was losing altitude. Peterson tried to hold it level but the dying engine could not maintain power. They descended from 10,000 feet to 8,000. Then to 6,000. The ground grew larger below them. Fields and forests. A river cutting through the landscape. The engine quit completely at 4,000 feet. One final cough and then silence. The only sound was wind rushing past the canopy. The propeller windmilled uselessly. They were gliding. A heavy, overloaded glider with 2 men crammed into a single seat. Peterson scanned the ground below, looking for anywhere to land. He spotted a field 3 miles ahead. It looked flat. No visible obstacles. It would have to do. He aimed for it and began his descent. Walsh watched the altimeter spin down. 3,000 feet. 2,000, 1,000. The field grew larger. He could see it was rough ground. Plowed furrows. Not ideal for landing. But they had no choice. It was the only option. Peterson dropped the landing gear at 500 feet. He felt the wheels lock into place. He lowered full flaps. The Mustang settled into a steep glide. The field rushed up to meet them. The ground was coming fast. Too fast. The wheels hit the furrows hard. The aircraft bounced. Peterson held the stick steady. The Mustang bounced again, higher this time. Walsh was thrown against the canopy. His head hit the glass. He saw stars. The third bounce was smaller. The aircraft settled onto the rough ground and began rolling across the furrows. The landing gear groaned under the stress. Metal creaked. Peterson stood on the brakes. The wheels locked and skidded. The Mustang slowed. Slowed more, finally stopped in the middle of the field. The aircraft was intact. The landing gear had held. They were down. They were alive. And when Peterson looked around, he saw American tanks on the ridge 400 yards away. They had made it. Against impossible odds, after 11 days as prisoners, after stealing a German-marked fighter, after flying 200 miles crammed into a single seat, they had made it to Allied territory. Walsh tried to open the canopy. His arms were so cramped he could barely lift them. Peterson reached around him and pulled the release. The canopy popped open. Fresh air rushed into the cockpit. It was the sweetest thing Walsh had ever tasted. American soldiers were running toward the aircraft from the tank position. They had their rifles ready, not sure if this was a German trick. The Mustang had German markings. It could be an enemy aircraft trying to infiltrate Allied lines. Walsh climbed out first. He stood on the wing and raised his hands. He shouted in English. American pilots, escaped prisoners. Do not shoot. The soldiers kept their rifles pointed at him but stopped advancing. Peterson tried to climb out after Walsh. His legs would not move. They were completely dead from 2 hours of pressure. He sat in the cockpit and tried to wiggle his toes. Nothing. He tried to flex his ankles. Nothing. The circulation had been cut off for too long. The American soldiers reached the aircraft. A lieutenant climbed onto the wing and looked into the cockpit. He saw Peterson sitting there in dirty prison clothes, his face thin from starvation, his legs useless. The lieutenant immediately called for medics. 4 soldiers lifted Peterson from the cockpit and carried him to a jeep. Medics checked his legs. The feeling was starting to return. Painful tingles ran through his feet and calves. The medic said he would be fine. Just temporary nerve compression. Nothing permanent. Walsh sat on the ground next to the jeep. His own legs were cramped but functional. He was bruised from being thrown against the canopy during landing. His head hurt where he had hit the glass. But he was alive. He was free. He was on Allied soil. The lieutenant asked them how they had gotten here. Peterson told him the short version. Shot down 11 days ago. Captured by Germans, held as prisoners, escaped during an air raid, stole a P-51 with German markings, flew it west until the engine quit. The lieutenant looked at the single-seat cockpit. He looked at the 2 pilots. He asked the obvious question. How did both of you fit in that aircraft? Peterson smiled. It was the first time he had smiled in 11 days. He said they had squeezed. The lieutenant shook his head in disbelief. He had been in the army for 3 years. He had seen some incredible things during the war. But he had never seen anything like this. Peterson and Walsh were taken to a field hospital behind the front lines. They spent 3 days there, recovering from malnutrition and exhaustion. Peterson's legs recovered fully within 48 hours. The nerve damage was temporary. Walsh's bruises healed quickly. Both men gained back several pounds once they started eating regular meals again. The doctors were amazed by their story. 2 pilots crammed into a single-seat fighter for 2 hours. The medical team examined Peterson's legs carefully, worried about permanent damage. But the circulation returned completely. Within 3 days, he was walking normally again. Military intelligence officers interviewed them extensively. They wanted every detail about the German prison facility. How many prisoners were held there? How many guards? What was the layout? Where exactly was it located? The information would help plan future rescue operations. The captured P-51 Mustang was recovered from the field and examined by mechanics. Despite the rough landing, the aircraft was in good condition. After repairs and a repaint in American colors, it returned to service. It flew 23 more combat missions before the war ended. The story of their escape spread quickly through the Allied air forces. 2 pilots had been captured by Germans, held as prisoners for 11 days, then escaped and flew home together in a single-seat fighter. It seemed impossible. But the evidence was undeniable. The aircraft existed. The pilots were alive. Peterson's commanding officer faced a decision similar to what General Doolittle had faced with other rescue attempts. Peterson and Walsh had disobeyed regulations. They had taken enormous risks. They had stolen enemy property. By the book, they should face disciplinary action. But they had also escaped from a German prison and brought themselves home. They had demonstrated extraordinary courage and flying skill. They had proven that even capture was not the end. The commanding officer chose to commend them rather than punish them. Peterson received the Silver Star for his actions. The citation praised his leadership during captivity, his planning of the escape, and his skill in flying a heavily overloaded aircraft to safety. Walsh received the Distinguished Flying Cross for his role in the escape. Both men returned to the United States in May 1945, after the war in Europe ended. Peterson went home to Oklahoma and his wife. He had promised her he would come home. He had kept that promise despite being shot down and captured. Walsh returned to his family in Pennsylvania. He married his high school sweetheart in June 1945. He often told his children that he owed his life to Peterson. Without his captain's refusal to give up, Walsh would have spent the rest of the war in a German prison camp. Captain Richard Peterson remained in the Air Force after the war. He flew transport missions during the Berlin airlift in 1948. He served as a flight instructor for several years. He retired as a colonel in 1965 after 24 years of service. He settled in Oklahoma and worked as a commercial pilot for Braniff Airways. He flew for another 15 years, logging more than 20,000 hours in the air. He retired from commercial aviation in 1980 at the age of 62. He rarely spoke about his time as a prisoner of war. When he did tell the story, he always emphasized that the escape had been a team effort. Walsh had been just as important as Peterson in making it work. Without his wingman's trust and courage, the escape would have failed. Lieutenant David Walsh left the military in 1946. He returned to Pennsylvania and attended college on the GI Bill. He became a mechanical engineer and worked for Boeing for 35 years. He helped design flight control systems for commercial aircraft. He married and raised 4 children. He lived a full and happy life. A life that would not have existed if Peterson had not refused to give up during those 11 days in the German prison. Walsh never forgot that debt. The two men stayed in contact for the rest of their lives. They exchanged letters every few months. They attended Air Force reunions together. They shared a bond that only two men who had faced death and captivity together could understand. In 1995, 50 years after their escape, Walsh flew to Oklahoma to visit Peterson. The two old pilots sat in Peterson's living room and talked about that March day in 1945. They laughed about how cramped the cockpit had been. They marveled that the engine had held together long enough to reach Allied lines. Walsh thanked Peterson again for not giving up. For watching the guards and planning the escape, for having the courage to steal that aircraft. For getting them both home. Peterson said he had just done what any good officer would do. Take care of your men. Never leave anyone behind. Peterson passed away in 2003 at the age of 85. His funeral was attended by dozens of former Air Force pilots who had flown with him during the war and afterward. Walsh gave the eulogy. He spoke about a captain who refused to accept defeat, even when captured by the enemy. Walsh lived until 2009. He was 88 years old. Before he died, he wrote a detailed account of their escape for his grandchildren. He wanted them to know about the man who had saved his life. The man who had looked at an impossible situation and found a way through it. All of it had started with a refusal to give up. A captain who spent 11 days in a German prison but never stopped planning his escape. And a lieutenant who trusted his captain enough to climb into a single-seat fighter and attempt the impossible. The story of Peterson and Walsh is not found in most history books. There is no memorial to mark where they landed that day. The prison facility where they were held was destroyed decades ago. The men themselves chose not to seek fame or publicity for what they had done. But their story represents something important about the human spirit. It shows what people are capable of when they refuse to give up. It demonstrates that even in the worst situations, there is always hope. There is always a chance. You just have to be willing to take it. Peterson could have accepted his fate as a prisoner. He could have waited for the war to end in a German camp. It would have been the safe choice. The reasonable choice. But he refused to accept it. He watched for opportunities. He planned. He prepared. And when the moment came, he acted. Walsh could have refused to go along with the plan. He could have stayed in the cell where it was safe. The escape attempt was dangerous. The odds of success were low. But he trusted his captain. He chose courage over safety. And that choice saved both their lives. The escape succeeded because of planning, courage, and an enormous amount of luck. The air raid could have missed their facility. The door lock could have been stronger. The Mustang could have been damaged. The fuel could have run out sooner. Any of 100 things could have gone wrong. But Peterson made the attempt anyway. He could not control luck. He could only control his own actions. And he chose to act rather than wait. That choice made all the difference. Their story also teaches us about trust between comrades. Walsh trusted Peterson enough to climb into that cramped cockpit. He trusted his captain's planning, his flying skills, his determination. That trust was built over months of flying together. Of watching each other's backs in combat. Of knowing that the man next to you would never leave you behind. Stories like this one are disappearing. The men who lived them are gone. The aircraft they flew exist only in museums. The prisons where they were held have been torn down. In another generation, there will be no one left who remembers these events firsthand. That is why we tell these stories. They preserve something important about courage and determination and refusing to give up. They remind us that ordinary people faced extraordinary challenges and found ways to overcome them. They show us what humans are capable of when everything is on the line. If this story moved you, please hit that like button right now. Every like tells YouTube to show this to more people. Share this with someone who needs to hear a story about never giving up. Leave a comment and tell us where you are watching from. United States, United Kingdom, Canada, Australia. We have viewers all around the world. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss these forgotten stories. We rescue history every single day. Real people, real courage, real determination, stories that deserve to be remembered. Thank you for watching. Thank you for making sure Captain Richard Peterson and Lieutenant David Walsh are not forgotten. Thank you for keeping their memory alive. These men refused to give up, even when captured by the enemy. They deserve to be remembered. And you are helping make that happen.